Picture this. It's February 28th, 2022. Just 4 days ago, Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine. Cities are burning. Millions of people are fleeing their homes. Children are hiding in subway stations. The world watches in horror as Europe faces its biggest war since 1945. And in the middle of this chaos, President Volodymyr Zelensky does something that catches everyone off guard. He submits Ukraine's application to join the European Union. Not after the war. Not when things calm down. Right now, in the middle of the nightmare. Some called it desperate. Others called it brilliant. But everyone understood one thing. Ukraine was betting everything on Europe. Fast forward to today, February 2026. Almost 4 years have passed since that moment. Ukraine has achieved something remarkable. They've completed the fastest EU screening process in history, racing through requirements that normally take other countries years to finish. Ukrainian officials have worked around the clock, even while their country fights for survival, to prove they deserve a seat at Europe's table. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called their progress unprecedented. And yet, despite all this effort, despite all the reforms and sacrifices, Ukraine's path to EU membership is frozen. Not because of Russian threats, not because Ukraine failed to meet the standards, but because of a single veto from inside the European Union itself. One country, Hungary, has the power to block everything. And that's exactly what it's doing. This situation raises a question that nobody saw coming just a few years ago. Is EU membership still the golden ticket Ukraine thinks it is? Is it still worth fighting for? The dream of joining Europe has driven Ukrainian politics for over a decade. People died for it during the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, when protesters filled the streets of Kyiv after their president abandoned an EU agreement to cozy up to Russia instead. Ukrainians have always seen EU membership as their ticket to prosperity, security, and freedom. It represented a final break from Russia's shadow and a guarantee that they would never be pulled back into Moscow's orbit. But the world has changed dramatically since those idealistic days. To understand what's really happening here, we need to rewind the clock. Ukraine's journey toward Europe didn't start in 2022. The seeds were planted back in 2014 during those freezing winter nights on Kyiv's South Independence Square. That's when ordinary Ukrainians, students, and grandmothers and office workers stood in the cold demanding their government sign a deal with the European Union. When their president refused and tried to crush the protests with violence, it sparked a revolution. The president fled. Ukraine got a new government, and they immediately pivoted toward Europe. By 2017, Ukrainians could travel visa-free to most European countries for the first time ever. It felt like progress, like momentum. Then 2022 came, and everything exploded. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion, Ukraine's application suddenly meant something different. This wasn't just about trade deals and economic benefits anymore. This was about survival. Just 4 months after applying, on June 23, 2022, Ukraine received official EU candidate status. It was the fastest any country had ever achieved this. 2 years later, in June 2024, formal negotiations began. By September 2025, Ukraine had completed the screening of all 35 negotiation chapters, a process that includes everything from environmental standards to judicial independence. They were moving at light speed. Ukraine's government even set an ambitious target: full EU membership by January 2027. It sounds impossible, and honestly, it probably is. But here's what makes this whole story so fascinating and so tragic at the same time. Despite doing everything right, despite reforming faster than anyone expected, despite fighting a war and still meeting European standards, Ukraine now finds itself stuck. And the question hanging over everything is this: in a world that's changed so dramatically, where old rules no longer apply, and new dangers emerge every day, is EU membership still the geopolitical advantage Ukraine desperately needs? Or has the game changed so much that this decades-old dream might not even matter anymore? Let's talk about where things actually stand right now, because the details matter. Ukraine isn't just any country trying to join the European Union. If it succeeds, it would be the largest country by territory to join since the EU was founded. It would also be the poorest member by far, with an economy that's been devastated by war. We're talking about a country where GDP per capita is roughly 1/5 of the EU average. This is a massive undertaking for everyone involved. But here's what's truly remarkable. Ukraine has been moving at a pace that's left European bureaucrats stunned. Normally, the EU accession process is painfully slow. Countries spend years, sometimes decades, working through what's called the screening process. This is where EU officials examine every aspect of a candidate country to see if they meet European standards. There are 35 different chapters covering everything from how you regulate food safety to whether your courts are independent enough. It's exhaustive and deliberate by design. Yet Ukraine completed this entire process by September 2025. They did in months what takes other countries years. And they did it while fighting a war. Think about what that means practically. Ukrainian officials were negotiating environmental regulations while Russian missiles hit their cities. They were reforming their judicial system while soldiers fought on the front lines. They strengthened anti-corruption agencies even as the country operated under martial law. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen wasn't exaggerating when she called this unprecedented. No country in EU history has maintained this level of reform momentum under these conditions. Ukraine has also been integrating into European life in smaller but meaningful ways. As of January 2026, Ukrainians can use their mobile phones across the EU without roaming charges, just like EU citizens. Ukrainian students participate in Erasmus exchange programs. Ukrainian researchers collaborate on Horizon Europe projects. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They're building real connections between Ukraine and the rest of Europe. The formal process works like this. Those 35 chapters get grouped into 6 thematic clusters. Each cluster covers related topics. One cluster might deal with rule of law and fundamental rights. Another handles economic issues. For negotiations to progress, each cluster has to open with the unanimous approval of all 27 EU member states. Then Ukraine works on meeting the requirements. When they've satisfied everyone, the cluster closes, again with unanimous approval. Only when all clusters are closed can a country actually join. Ukraine has already met the technical requirements to open 3 of these clusters. The European Commission has verified their progress. The paperwork is ready. Everything is in order, except for one problem that has nothing to do with Ukraine's performance. Hungary is blocking everything. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has wielded his veto power to prevent the formal opening of Ukraine's accession talks. His official reasons sound reasonable enough on the surface. He talks about protecting the rights of ethnic Hungarians living in Western Ukraine. He warns about the economic risks of expanding the EU too quickly. He expresses concern about integrating war into the European Union. But when you look at the pattern of Hungary's behavior, a different picture emerges. Since the Russian invasion began in 2022, Hungary has blocked more than half of all EU foreign policy decisions related to Ukraine. Budapest has obstructed sanctions packages against Russia. They've delayed military aid when Ukraine needed it most. They've extracted financial concessions from the EU by threatening to derail Ukrainian support at critical moments. In December 2025, when all 26 other EU member states sent ministers to an informal meeting in Lviv to advance Ukraine's accession, Hungary was the only country that boycotted it. The only one. This isn't just frustrating for Ukraine. It's creating a constitutional crisis for the EU itself. How can an institution function when one member state can paralyze the entire union's foreign policy? The EU has tried to find workarounds, and they've gotten creative. In December 2025, European officials unveiled something they're calling a 10-point reform plan. This allows Ukraine to continue technical preparations without formal political approval from all member states. It's unprecedented. The EU has never before shared negotiating positions with a candidate country before officially opening the clusters. But they're doing it now because the alternative is letting one country completely derail the process. Commissioner for Enlargement Marta Kos put it bluntly when she said that nobody can veto Ukraine from doing reforms. The EU is essentially saying, we can't force Hungary to approve the formal opening, but we can make sure Ukraine keeps working as if it already happened. It's a clever bureaucratic solution, but it raises an obvious question. Can technical progress really substitute for political momentum? Can you prepare for a marathon that might never actually start? So why does any of this matter? Why is EU membership such a big deal for Ukraine, and why should anyone in Europe care? The answer goes way beyond economics. This is fundamentally about how Europe protects itself in a world that's gotten dangerous again. For Ukraine, EU membership represents something they can't get anywhere else right now: real security. Everyone knows Ukraine wants to join NATO. That would give them the ultimate security guarantee under Article 5, where an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. But NATO membership isn't happening anytime soon. Too many member countries are worried about being dragged into direct conflict with Russia. So for Ukraine, the EU has become the next best thing. While the European Union isn't a military alliance like NATO, membership would still make Ukraine an integral part of Europe's security architecture. President Zelensky has been explicit about this. He's called EU accession one of the key security guarantees for Ukraine's future. Recent reports suggest that Ukraine's 2027 membership goal is actually being discussed as part of potential peace negotiation frameworks with the United States. Think about what that means strategically. EU membership would make an attack on Ukraine an attack on the European economic and political order itself. It dramatically raises the stakes for any aggressor. Russia could theoretically launch missiles at a non-EU Ukraine without triggering a wider European response. But attacking an EU member state? That's an entirely different calculation. The economic transformation is equally important. Ukraine needs an estimated $411 billion just to rebuild what the war has destroyed. But this isn't just about reconstruction. This is about modernizing an entire economy that's been stuck in post-Soviet patterns for decades. EU membership would force Ukraine to meet European standards in everything from banking regulations to product safety. That sounds bureaucratic, but it's actually transformative. It means foreign investors can trust Ukrainian institutions. It means Ukrainian businesses can access the world's largest single market without barriers. It means guaranteed access to EU development funds that help poorer regions catch up. The EU has already committed 50 billion euros to Ukraine through something called the Ukraine Facility, which runs through 2027. But that's just emergency support. Full membership would open up structural funds that dwarf those numbers. Trade between Ukraine and the EU has more than doubled since their free trade agreement came into force, reaching 67 billion euros in 2024. Imagine what happens when all remaining barriers disappear. Here's what people often miss, though. Ukraine isn't just taking from Europe. Ukraine brings enormous value to the table. Their military has become Europe's most experienced fighting force. No EU army has the combat knowledge that Ukraine has gained fighting a peer adversary. Once modernized to EU standards, Ukraine's defense industry could make major contributions to European security. The continent is finally waking up to the need for rearmament, and Ukraine can help with that efficiently and cost-effectively. Energy security is another huge factor. Ukraine sits on vast natural gas reserves and critical minerals needed for the green energy transition. Integrating Ukraine would accelerate Europe's independence from Russian energy, which has been a strategic nightmare since the invasion. Ukraine is also one of the world's great agricultural powers. We're talking about a country that used to be called the breadbasket of Europe. Properly integrated, Ukrainian agriculture strengthens European food security at a time when climate change and geopolitical instability threaten global food supplies. Then there's human capital. Ukraine has a vibrant technology sector and a highly educated workforce. Over 4 million Ukrainians have already moved to EU countries since 2022, and they're contributing skills and labor across the continent. These aren't refugees waiting to go home. Many are integrating into European societies, starting businesses, filling labor shortages, paying taxes. Geographically, Ukraine's membership would fundamentally change Europe's strategic position. Right now, Ukraine is what security analysts call a gray zone, a space between rival power blocks where influence is contested and conflict becomes likely. Adding Ukraine to the EU eliminates that gray zone. It extends the EU's eastern border and creates strategic depth that Europe currently lacks. Former Lithuanian official Andrius Kubilius argues that this removes one of Europe's most dangerous security vulnerabilities. Beyond the tangible benefits, there's a powerful symbolic dimension. Ukraine's accession would send an unmistakable message: aggression doesn't work. Russia cannot veto a sovereign nation's choice through military force. This matters beyond Ukraine. Georgia and Moldova are also EU candidates. Western Balkan countries have been waiting for membership for years. They're all watching Ukraine closely. If Ukraine can't join despite its sacrifices and reforms, what hope do they have? But if Ukraine succeeds, it proves the European project is still dynamic, still capable of expansion, still relevant in the 21st century. It would inspire democratic movements across the entire post-Soviet space, potentially even inside Russia itself. But let's be completely honest about the obstacles, because they're massive. Ukraine's path to EU membership isn't just difficult. It might be impossible unless some fundamental things change. Start with the most obvious problem. Ukraine is at war. In the entire history of European integration, the EU has never admitted a country in active armed conflict. Never. There's no rulebook for this because it was never supposed to happen. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated plainly in January 2026 that Ukraine cannot join by 2027, emphasizing they need to fully meet the Copenhagen criteria first. Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán has claimed that letting Ukraine in would mean integrating war into the European Union itself. Even if a ceasefire or peace agreement happens tomorrow, Ukraine will still face ongoing security threats for years, probably decades. The EU doesn't have the military capabilities to defend Ukraine's borders if they become Europe's borders. That would require a fundamental transformation of how the EU operates, including developing military structures it currently doesn't possess. Are European countries ready for that? The evidence suggests no. The economic challenges are equally daunting. Ukraine's GDP per capita is about one-fifth the EU average. Integration would require absolutely massive financial transfers through the Common Agricultural Policy and structural funds. These are the programs that send money to poorer EU regions to help them develop. Right now, countries like Poland and Hungary receive billions from these programs. But if Ukraine joins, the math changes dramatically. There's only so much money in the EU budget, and Ukraine would have a legitimate claim to a huge chunk of it. Polish and Hungarian politicians have been remarkably blunt about this. Orbán has claimed that all of Hungary's EU money would end up going to Ukraine instead. It's an exaggeration, but the underlying concern is real. Current recipient countries fear their allocations would shrink. Wealthier countries like Germany and the Netherlands don't want to massively increase their contributions. The EU budget negotiations for the period covering Ukraine's potential membership would be absolutely brutal. Without serious budget reform, Ukraine's membership could paralyze EU finances. Corruption is another major vulnerability. Ukraine has made real progress on this front, but the problem remains deeply rooted. In July 2025, Ukrainian lawmakers briefly voted to undermine the independence of their anti-corruption agencies. The European Union immediately condemned the move in the strongest terms. President Zelensky reversed the decision within hours, but the episode revealed how fragile these reforms really are. Then in late 2025, a major corruption scandal erupted involving one of Zelensky's former business associates, raising questions about whether elite accountability has really changed. EU officials have been crystal clear: anti-corruption reforms are non-negotiable. One major backslide, one return to the old ways of doing business, and the entire accession process could collapse. Ukraine is trying to change centuries-old patterns of governance while fighting an existential war. That's an almost impossible task. Agriculture presents yet another explosive issue. Ukraine's massive agricultural sector terrifies farmers across the European Union. Even before membership, Ukrainian grain imports have sparked protests in Poland, France, and other countries. European farmers see Ukrainian competition as an existential threat. They operate under strict EU regulations that increase their costs. Ukrainian farmers, not yet bound by all those rules, can produce more cheaply. The Common Agricultural Policy, which protects European farmers with subsidies and price supports, would need a complete overhaul to accommodate Ukraine. This is politically toxic in multiple member states where farmers are a powerful voting bloc. Then there's the institutional paralysis problem. The EU already struggles to make decisions with 27 member states. Adding Ukraine would make governance even more difficult. The accession process itself requires more than 70 unanimous votes. If Hungary can paralyze everything now, imagine the dysfunction with more members and more competing interests. European Commission President von der Leyen has acknowledged that the EU probably needs treaty changes to accommodate further enlargement. But changing the EU's founding treaties requires, you guessed it, unanimity. It's a circular problem with no obvious solution. There's also what analysts call enlargement fatigue. After 7 waves of expansion, many Europeans question whether the EU should keep growing at all. Public opinion polling shows declining enthusiasm in Western Europe for adding new members. France has historically preferred deepening integration among existing members rather than widening the union. Germany is torn between recognizing the geopolitical necessity of expansion and worrying about the costs and complications. Finally, there's the Trump factor and peace negotiations. With American leadership potentially seeking a rapid deal with Russia, Ukraine faces enormous pressure to accept territorial concessions. Would a Ukraine that doesn't control all its internationally recognized territory even be eligible for EU membership? What if Russia retains Crimea and parts of Donbass as part of a peace deal? Does Ukraine join as a truncated state, abandoning millions of its citizens in occupied territory? EU officials have been largely sidelined from peace talks, raising serious questions about Brussels' actual influence over outcomes that will determine Ukraine's borders and political status. Some analysts offer a harsh realist critique. They argue EU membership was always symbolic, a carrot to motivate reforms, but never meant to actually happen, at least not for decades. They point out that former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker said in 2016 it would take at least 20 to 25 years for Ukraine to join. The European political community, which France proposed in 2022, is widely seen as a substitute for real membership, a way to keep Ukraine in Europe's orbit without actual integration. Is the current urgency genuine, or just crisis-driven rhetoric that will fade once the immediate danger passes? So what actually happens next? Nobody knows for certain, but we can map out the most likely scenarios based on how similar situations have played out in the past. The first scenario is accelerated accession, where Ukraine joins by 2027 or 2028. For this to happen, several things would need to break Ukraine's way almost simultaneously. Hungary's Viktor Orbán would need to lose the April 2026 elections, or alternatively, Donald Trump would need to pressure him into backing down. A credible peace agreement, or at least a stable ceasefire, would need to be reached in 2026. EU member states would need to embrace something called gradual membership, which means allowing Ukraine to join while continuing reforms from inside the Union rather than requiring everything to be perfect first. And the EU would need to reform its decision-making rules, replacing some unanimity requirements with qualified majority voting so one country can't block everything. If all these dominoes fall in the right order, Ukraine could join by 2027 or 2028, making it the fastest major accession in EU history. But honestly, the probability of this happening is low, maybe 15 to 20%. Too many variables need to align perfectly, and history suggests they won't. The second scenario is staged integration over the next 4 to 8 years. This is what most serious analysts consider realistic. Ukraine slowly opens and closes negotiation clusters, making steady progress, but facing political resistance at every step. This resistance comes from multiple sources: Hungary's continued obstruction, farmer lobbies in Poland and France, budget hawks in the Netherlands and Germany. Technical compliance continues, and Ukraine gains intermediate benefits along the way. They get deeper access to the single market, more financial support, enhanced security cooperation. But full membership doesn't come until the early 2030s. During this period, the EU uses the time to reform its own institutions. They overhaul the budget framework to accommodate Ukraine's size and needs. They restructure agricultural policies so European farmers and Ukrainian farmers can coexist. They strengthen decision-making mechanisms so future enlargements don't face the same paralysis. This scenario has a moderate probability, maybe 40 to 45%. It's the conventional wisdom among people who follow EU politics closely. The third scenario is indefinite limbo, and it's darker. Ukraine becomes a permanent candidate, like Turkey, which has been in negotiations since 2005 with no realistic path to membership. Political will in the European Union fragments as other crises emerge. Migration, climate change, economic stagnation, and domestic political turmoil consume Brussels' attention. Enlargement fatigue deepens into enlargement rejection. Hungary continues blocking, and potentially other countries join the opposition. Slovakia, Austria, or the Czech Republic might form a coalition of states resistant to Ukrainian membership. In this scenario, Ukraine receives economic benefits and security cooperation, but never crosses the membership threshold. The EU creates alternative frameworks with names like Associated Partnership or Privileged Partnership. These provide some integration without full membership, letting European leaders claim they're supporting Ukraine without actually letting them join. This scenario also has moderate probability, maybe 30 to 35%. History suggests this is how enlargement often stalls when political will evaporates. The fourth scenario is geopolitical breakdown, the worst case. Russia extracts major territorial concessions from Ukraine in exchange for a ceasefire. Ukraine joins the EU eventually, but only in its reduced form, with millions of citizens abandoned in Russian-occupied territory. Or the war drags on indefinitely without resolution, and Ukraine can't join while active conflict continues. The country exhausts itself, brain drain accelerates as the best and brightest leave, and Ukraine becomes a frozen conflict state like Moldova, ironically also an EU candidate stuck in limbo. There's an even darker version where the EU itself fractures. Populist, pro-Russian governments come to power in more member states. The entire enlargement process collapses. This scenario has lower probability, maybe 15 to 20%, but it's rising. A lot depends on elections across Europe in 2026 and 2027. There's one fascinating wild card that could change everything: gradual integration. The EU is discussing fundamentally changing how membership works. The traditional model says reform completely first, then join. The proposed new model says start joining as you reform, with gradual integration into EU structures over time. Ukraine could gain voting rights in some areas, access to certain policies, and budget participation while still working on other requirements. This bypasses the binary in or out problem that makes the current system so rigid. It's completely unprecedented, but then again, so is admitting a country at war. The EU might rewrite the entire rulebook for Ukraine. Whether that's inspiring or terrifying depends on your perspective. Let us step back from all the technical details about budget formulas and negotiation clusters and ask the fundamental question: what is actually at stake here? This isn't really about whether Ukraine meets the technical criteria for EU membership. It's about whether the European Union can defend itself in a world that's fundamentally changed. For decades after the Cold War ended, the EU operated on a comfortable assumption. They believed that economic integration and soft power could transcend old-fashioned security competition. Military force was becoming obsolete. Territorial conquest was unthinkable in modern Europe. Countries would choose cooperation over conflict because prosperity was more valuable than power. The European Union was designed for this postmodern world, a world beyond geopolitics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shattered that entire worldview. We're not in a post-geopolitical world. We're back to 19th century power politics, territorial conquest, spheres of influence, zero-sum competition between great powers. The comfortable assumptions that shaped European thinking for 30 years have collapsed. The question now is whether the EU can adapt to this harsh new reality. Ukraine's membership is the test case for that adaptation. There are essentially three possible futures for Europe, and only one of them includes Ukraine. The first future is geopolitical Europe. In this version, the EU transforms from primarily a regulatory and economic body into a genuine geopolitical actor. It develops hard power capabilities, including coordinated military forces and rapid decision-making structures. It makes tough choices quickly instead of deliberating endlessly. It expands to include Ukraine and other Eastern European states because it recognizes that security requires strategic depth. This version of Europe becomes a real pole in a multipolar world order, capable of defending its interests without complete dependence on the United States. The second future is fragmented Europe. Internal divisions deepen and become unbridgeable. Northern Europe versus Southern Europe, Eastern Europe versus Western Europe, budget recipients versus contributors. These cleavages paralyze decision-making. The EU remains relevant as an economic zone, a single market for trade and commerce. But it becomes completely irrelevant in security matters, leaving that to NATO and thus to American leadership. It's a Europe that can regulate the curvature of bananas but can't defend its own borders. The third future is Fortress Europe. The EU consolidates around a Western European core, the original 6 founding members plus a few others. It doesn't expand further east, and possibly even ejects troublesome members. Hungary has already faced Article 7 proceedings for democratic backsliding. In this scenario, the EU decides that cohesion matters more than size. It's smaller but more unified, focused on deepening integration among members who share values and interests rather than expanding to include countries that complicate governance. Only the first future, Geopolitical Europe, includes Ukrainian membership. In the second and third futures, Ukraine remains outside, a permanent buffer state, perpetually vulnerable to Russian pressure and influence. The choice between these futures isn't made through a single dramatic vote. It emerges from hundreds of smaller decisions: budget negotiations, veto exercises, treaty reforms, sanctions packages. Each decision pulls Europe incrementally toward one future or another. But Ukraine forces the question into focus. The EU must decide what it wants to be. As one European security analyst put it, Ukraine's accession isn't charity or idealism. It's an investment in a European future where Russia cannot dominate through military force and where democratic values have defensive depth. Without Ukraine, Europe's eastern frontier remains contested, vulnerable, and dangerous. With Ukraine, Europe gains strategic weight, military capability, natural resources, and proof that the European project still works. The silent struggle is really this: can a consensus-based institution designed for economic cooperation in peaceful times transform itself into a geopolitical force capable of making hard choices in dangerous times? Can it accept a large, poor, war-torn country that fundamentally changes the Union's character? Ukraine has done its part. They've reformed faster than anyone expected. They've proven their commitment even while fighting for survival. The question isn't really about Ukraine anymore. It's about whether Europe has the political courage to match Ukraine's determination. So we return to the question we started with. Is EU membership still a geopolitical advantage for Ukraine? After everything we've explored, the answer turns out to be complicated, and it depends on which Ukraine and which Europe we're talking about. For Ukraine today, right now, fighting for its survival with Russian forces still occupying parts of its territory, EU membership absolutely remains crucial. It's more than just a distant goal or a symbolic aspiration. It's the most concrete path forward to long-term security that Ukraine actually has available. NATO membership remains blocked by political realities that aren't changing anytime soon. Security guarantees from individual countries are helpful but ultimately limited. The EU represents something more permanent, more institutional, more difficult to reverse. It's a tangible goal that motivates continued reforms even in the darkest moments. It attracts foreign investment that might otherwise stay away from a war zone. It provides a political anchor for post-war recovery, a framework that says Ukraine has a guaranteed future as part of the West. For the European Union, Ukraine's accession is simultaneously an enormous opportunity and an enormous risk. This is the fundamental tension that explains why progress has been so difficult. On one hand, bringing Ukraine in would extend European influence to the very borders of Russia. It would eliminate one of the continent's most dangerous gray zones, those contested spaces where influence is unclear and conflict becomes likely. It would demonstrate to the entire world that the European project can still expand, still adapt, still matter in an age of renewed geopolitical competition. Ukraine would bring military capabilities, natural resources, agricultural power, and human capital that Europe desperately needs. But on the other hand, Ukraine would fundamentally change what the European Union is. It would require massive financial commitments at a time when many EU countries are already struggling economically. It would complicate decision-making in an institution that already moves too slowly. It would force Europe to confront security threats that most Western Europeans thought were permanently relegated to history books. This isn't a minor adjustment to the status quo. This is a transformational choice that would reshape Europe's future. The silent struggle at the heart of this story is really about whether a consensus-based institution designed for economic cooperation can transform itself into a geopolitical force. Can the EU make hard choices? Can it accept a member that doesn't fit the comfortable mold of previous expansions? Can it move beyond the post-Cold War assumptions that have guided European thinking for 3 decades? Technical progress continues week by week. Reform plans get signed. Screening processes finish ahead of schedule. Ukrainian officials keep working, keep implementing changes, keep proving their commitment. But political will, That's the resource in desperately short supply. Hungary's veto is just the most visible symptom of a deeper problem. The real question is whether Germany, France, Italy, and other major powers will spend the political capital necessary to bring Ukraine in over the objections of farmers, budget hawks, skeptics, and isolationists. The timeline ahead tells us something important. 2026 is the critical year. Hungarian elections happen in April. Peace negotiations will either make real progress or stall completely. EU budget discussions for the 2027 to 2033 period will reveal whether member states can find the money for Ukrainian integration. 2027 is Ukraine's target date for membership. Almost everyone agrees this is unrealistic, but the goal creates urgency and keeps pressure on European institutions. 2028 to 2030 represents a more plausible window if political obstacles start clearing. 2030 to 2035 is the conventional estimate if the process follows historical patterns from previous enlargements. But here's the final thought that matters most. History will judge this moment not by whether Ukraine met some technical checklist, but by whether Europe rose to meet an existential challenge. This is one of those hinge points where the future takes shape. Either the European Union proves it can adapt to a dangerous world and emerges stronger, more capable, more relevant than before, or it reveals its fundamental inability to move beyond comfortable bureaucratic procedures even when the stakes couldn't be higher. The geopolitical advantage isn't just for Ukraine. It's for a European Union that must choose between embracing its role as a real security actor or resigning itself to slow irrelevance in a world dominated by powers willing to use force. Ukraine has already made its choice. Ukrainians have paid an unimaginable price to break free from Russia's orbit and anchor themselves to Europe. They've done the reforms. They've met the standards. They've proven their commitment not just with paperwork, but with blood. The question that remains, the question that will define Europe's future for generations, is simpler than all the technical complexity suggests. Has Europe made its choice? Will it match Ukraine's courage with its own? The world is watching, and the answer is still being written.